All right, well, good morning, everyone. I think we have a quorum. This next session, Islam, Secularism, and the Rise of Europe's Far Right, aims to look at the relationship between religion and the far right. We understand, I think Katrin Benhold is writing a book on this subject in part right now, which has, I think, come up a couple of times in past gatherings here. Comments I know from Shadi, from Matt Goodwin, from Eric Kaufman, from Mattia, and others who have written on these themes. So eager to get into it. How do we talk about the role of religious faith and religious memory and religion when it comes to the far right? We have a pair of scholars this morning who can do so without the unhelpful sweeping generalizations, but at the same time, I think hopefully calling out some helpful and nuanced truths. How does national populism and immigration impact the way that Muslims are seen, in particular in places like Holland and France and Germany and the UK and Spain and elsewhere? Does religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but also the non-monotheistic traditions ever act as a check to far-right momentum, to more totalizing visions? I remember Shadi's comment in this room a few years ago when he talked about Muslim envy and this idea that people in declining traditions would observe faithfulness and want it, sometimes particularly in different parts of Europe. It has some sticking power, and a couple people wrote about that afterwards. Both this morning's speakers have also written on grievance and on societal and public impact of religious decline, on ways that growing expressions of nationalism sometimes makes room for outright racism. Whether it's laïcité or the right to wear hijab in public, Gaza, or a series of recent elections, Marine Le Pen, National Rally, AfD in Germany, a spate of national populist elections more broadly. This conversation is hopefully going to touch on immigration, on anti-Semitism, on Christianity, the far right, and on the frameworks that can be helpful with these controversial issues, contentious issues. So Fareed Hafez is going to start us off. He has just become a professor at the College of William & Mary after having been at Williams as a professor of international relations since 2021. He has published over 150 essays in peer-reviewed or other international journals. He was previously a researcher and a lecturer at Salzburg. Prior to that, a Fulbright visiting professor at Berkeley in 2017. And he is the founding editor of Islamophobia Studies Yearbook since 2010, and co-editor of the annual European Islamophobia Report since 2015, which draws on input from 40 scholars at 30 plus, covering 30 plus different European countries. Rokhaya Diallo is a French journalist and a writer and an award-winning filmmaker. She is widely recognized for her work advancing equality and racial justice. A piece in the New York Times called her activism. She described her as one of France's most prominent anti-racism activists. She's directed several documentaries, including the award-winning Steps to Liberty, a film following young Americans who come to France to examine issues of race, diversity, and human rights. Her 2020 documentary, Acting While Black, raises challenging questions about the roles that are given to black actors and actresses on French screens. And she's written several books and won the France TF1 Women in Digital Communications Award. So far right and religion. Fareed, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to share this room with you for a couple of days and have interesting discussions. All right, let's get straight to it. First of all, a few words in terms of the work as I was introduced. I've been working primarily on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. It was not my initial interest, to be honest, as a political scientist. Back in the days, but it felt like, the rise of the far right was so strong in Austria, which, as you know, with Jörg Haider back in 2000 was one of the most successful and first far right parties in then the European Union that participated in a government. So there was a real reason when there was a lot of Islamophobia starting in 2005 in the political landscape, in the political rhetoric, that somebody should address that. And I felt like a lot of my white political science colleagues would not do it, and that's why I just started this work. And that's how, one thing leads to the other. My initial interest was actually something very different, state-church relationship. But in a way, it is, it comes together, right? So which is also something that I will talk a little bit about today. The thing that I might disappoint you with is that I'm not going to necessarily speak about faith, because my idea of when I talk about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, I use those terminologies synonymously, is basically similar to any other form of racism, that we're not talking about those who are racialized, but we're actually talking about those who do the racialization. Which means, and I usually draw on people like Jean-Paul Sartre and others, in his essay in 1948, The Jew and the Anti-Semite, he said, if the Jew would not exist, the anti-Semite would have invented him. So basically, it's not who the Muslim is, what Islam is. It's really about the projection of the racist, right? This is what we're talking about. And this is also my theoretical approach to understanding what is going on with anti-Muslim racism. So in many ways, that's what probably most of the European folks here are familiar with when we talk about the so-called Jewish question 120 years back. What we understood back then was that was a real question for the people, right? Like the people assumed, white dominant societies assumed that we really have an issue with those Jews not fitting in, right? But as some critical Jewish scholars back in the days already said, this is really not a Jewish question. It's, depending on which country they're from, it's a German question. It's a French question. So they are posing those questions to us, right? And in similar way, we are now in a phase, I feel, or I think I know, where we really have the so-called Muslim question that is very real to the white dominant societies. And it's very difficult sometimes to have these discussions because for the white dominant society, these questions are real questions about religion. Well, I don't see the religion part there, right? So this is kind of my approach to the whole topic. There is another challenge in the European space, and whenever I talk about Europe, I basically mean everything except of the UK, because the UK is, culturally speaking, part of the Anglo-Saxon world where things work very differently. But I primarily speak about continental Europe, primarily the western part, including also the Scandinavian countries. So one of the issues we have is whenever we speak about race in that context, we assume that we're living in a post-racial society where race is not an issue. And people having hard times even to conceptualize and bring together the question of race in Islam. And with the lack of understanding of what race is and how race works as a social construct, it is even more difficult to have these conversations, apart from the UK again. Because the assumption is not only that we're living in a post-racial society, but also that actually after 1945, there is no racism problem anymore. So we have overcome the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and actually the real racists are now the Muslim immigrants, right? So we're projecting that on the new folks who have come in. Now, let me make a huge jump here. When it comes to Islam and the role of Muslims in Europe, there has been a paradigm shift in terms of how the state and, so to say, the power centers have been dealing with that issue. Because right up to the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a perspective dominating the discourse, which is, some scholars have called it embassy Islam, which basically means European governments did not necessarily care about Muslims and their faith and their religious traditions. And they basically argued, well, it's going to be the embassies of the countries where they came from, they're going to take care of that. So in France, the Algerian, Moroccan governments, in Germany, Austria, the Turkish governments, and so on and so forth. So in a way, it was like saying there is a labor division here. Whenever it comes to religious aspects, let the countries of origin take care of them. And that was obviously implied in a basic assumption. The assumption being that those people won't stay here forever, right? Which also has a very heavily political implication that I believe is very often underestimated, which is that democracy, the way it was built post-1945, is actually a democracy for white people, from white people, and never envisioned to include people of color, people of the global south, including Muslims. Now that is an important aspect, I believe, because also the question of religious liberty and civil liberties is very much connected to that, to this aspect. Now the change occurred in the late 1990s when the conviction grew and the understanding grew that these people will stay. We're going to have family reunification. These people won't go back to the countries of their origin. And that was also the beginning of a new era of the governmentality of Muslim religion specifically. And why I say Muslim religion specifically is because in all those different regulations of how state church was organized in various different European countries, and we know that there are many differences here, there is one important similarity that is common to a lot of them, which is that the dominant Christian church is treated in a different way compared to most of the other religious institutions and organizations. That might also include that, for instance, let's say in my country where I'm originally from, in Austria, the Protestants have been discriminated against vis-a-vis the Catholic, which is the dominant church. But even more so, especially in legal ways, when it comes to the Muslim denominations. Now, after 9/11 in around 2006 and 2007, there grew this understanding within the circles of power that it's actually the Ministry of Interior that should take care of that issue, which is an interesting take in the first place because it reveals something about, how, through which lens you look at that religious minority. It's not necessarily the religion lens, it's the security lens. But it's the security lens that should include also the governmentality of religion. And that is an important change that happened in 2006-07, which I think we're still witnessing until these days. And I'll get a little bit more into detail here. Now, I think there is one important aspect when we speak about Europe, which is something that is really at stake. Which is the future of how we envision European societies to be and the demographic change that is very real. Now, whatever European country you're from, you will see that there are national academies of sciences who do these projections on how many Muslims will live in our country until 2050, right? And then you have all these projections like 5 scenarios, 0 immigration, maximum immigration, fertility rate, this and that. And, in most Western European countries, apart from France and Austria, where we have about 9 to 10% of the whole population being Muslim, the vast majority of other countries, we're speaking about roughly 5% in Western Europe. And the projection until 2045, as most of these academies have done research on, is between 15 to 25, 30%, which is a huge amount of the whole population. So that is something that is very real. And the question is like, how do we address that? What sorts of accommodation of Muslim religion in the public space do we want to have? I'm just looking at the time, not to exceed my 20 minutes. So part of the story is obviously that since the late 1990s, at least, right-wing populism has grown as a sort of a political family. Part of it is also that anti-Muslim racism has become an official platform of many of these right-wing populist parties, and they have an answer. But that's only one of the answers of a couple of answers. And I would say there are 2.5 approaches to that question of the demographic change and the presence of Muslims in Europe in regards to how do we envision the future. Now, the far right basically argues, kick them all out in a very simple way, right? I don't know if you followed the news. There was an after party after a far-right rally by the identitarian movement a month or a couple of weeks ago, where there was like an investigative journalist who participated in that after party, and there was a lady from the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, who said, well, we really need Srebrenica 2.0 for the Muslims in Germany, right? Clearly, these things are not articulated publicly, but that's what the people think. Like, to be very, very open with all of you here, right? This is what is on the minds of the people. Now, clearly, if we speak about the organized far right that is represented in parliament, this is a different story. Because the way they approach the issue is, we know we can't kick them just out. Half of them, probably in most countries, are citizens, right? How can we kick them out? So there was another super investigative story, also this time taking place in Germany in the fall of last year, where a closed workshop was held. The guy who did the keynote was an Austrian from the identitarian movement. And during that keynote, he gave a proposition of what shall we do? And he coined this terminology of remigration. I'm sure some of you have heard about that, read in the news. Became quite a popular notion within far right circles. The idea basically being, well, we have to re-migrate those immigrants to go back. Because we can't do that in a legal way, the proposition was, we're gonna make life unbearable for them. So that's how we're gonna indirectly create such a pressure that they basically gonna go back out of their own will, all right? So that's proposition number 1, okay? That's the far right's idea of how we handle this Muslim issue. The second approach is a much more mainstream approach, I would say, and it's not a one-way street. And that's the approach that is primarily championed by the center-right, in some cases also the center-left, like Denmark, like Sweden. We have seen examples of that. The idea is assimilate the vast majority by working with the Muslims themselves, identifying those Muslims who are on the same page with us, create institutions that will reform and create some sort of domesticated Islam. That was also the initial proposition in 2006-07 by all these ministries of interior. The idea, the proclamated idea was, we're going to have an Islam français, a Dutch Islam, a German Islam, and whatever Islam. So there are 2 ways of how to achieve that. First of all, you build institutions to reform the Muslims. You have collaborators who do that work with you from within the Muslim community. And the other strategy that simultaneously has to work is you criminalize all of the opposition. You get rid of the few who are really a pain for you, all right? Basically those who have their own political agency, who do not want to be co-opted by the state and who think and act freely on their own. And this is what we see. We see that in France, like Macron. One of the very first things he said when he came to power, just I think 2 months after he became president, was we have to restructure the relationship of Islam and France, right? 3 years later, he did the separatism law, the anti-separatism law, which was basically a crackdown, a massive crackdown, surveillance program on organized Muslim associations and anti-racist organizations who fought back against those racist policies. So that's like the second approach. And then there is a half approach. The reason why I say not a full approach is because people are not very clear about what they really want. And it's a sort of a blurred position that we primarily find within the left. And that is, it is oscillating between the second approach of the center-right and on the other side, grappling with the problem of actually the left does not want religion. That's why they're having troubles with dealing with Muslims. But at the very same time, there is some ideological impetus to argue that, well, actually, we are anti-racist or we are pro-minorities and we need to protect them in the name of human rights. And there is a tension here. But there is not a clear-cut strategy within the left, including the Green parties, of how to deal with that. And I would say when in power, most of them are actually doing what the center-right has proposed. And we're seeing that across the board. All right. Now, the interesting thing, I believe, in terms of the observation, is that what we are seeing here is that the way of how religion or Muslim religion is governed is very akin to the authoritarian post-colonial state in Muslim-majority countries. Now, once becoming independent from colonialism, what happened in most of the Muslim-majority countries is they fully co-opted religion for their own gain, using it as a sort of a soft power to convince their citizens of different policies, using it in a way to also minimize opposition that came from the Islamist camp, and trying to use religion as a sort of a tool for exercising power. So it is a resource to govern a potential security threat. And that feeling has especially grown after the Arab Spring and have even made conversations between lots of leaders of the Arab and Muslim world with European leaders much more relevant and interesting. And there is an interesting dynamic that has grown out of that. Part of it is obviously also, since religion politics in regards to Islam is seen through the lens of security, that the global war on terror, with all of its infrastructure that was built within the last 25 years, or 23 years, has led not only to the securitization of the Muslim subject per se, but it has also expanded the authoritarian state, which is something that I feel is the whole Muslim question is only part of a larger tendency, which is the growing authoritarianism that we see in Europe. Like the most explicit form of articulating that would be Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy. But the other version of it is obviously that we see the reduction of civil liberties, of religious freedom, and civil liberties, specifically the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, and other basic freedoms that are very much intertwined with public religious organizations. And I would say this is how we have to analyze the whole Muslim question. Because clearly, again, the UK is very different, but in most of the other European countries in Western Europe, what we see is that Muslims represent the economically and politically and socially speaking, the weakest part of the society, maybe the weakest after the Roma. So their resources to fight back are hardly existing. Solidarity with them on the side of other civic organizations, even including some of the anti-racist organizations, are hardly there. So they are a very easy target. And based on the policies that are being implemented against the Muslims, we see also the expansion of these authoritarian tools being adopted for other groups. Just to give you a couple of examples, like we see how the counterterrorism state has been used against animal activists, against climate activists, against other groups who in one way or another pose a challenge, politically speaking, to the hegemonic forces. All right, I see I have already exceeded 2 minutes.
Great.
All right, that's very kind of you.
So 20 to 25, you're good.
I'm basically coming to the conclusion. So, because the question is like, what does the future look like? And what shall we do about that? I'm very pessimistic. I'm everything else but optimistic, which does not mean that there is nothing to do, but there is clearly a lack of understanding, I believe, in the broader society that this is a problem in the first place. I think there is hardly any consciousness and understanding in regards to what anti-Muslim racism does, not only to the Muslim minorities, but to the overall societies. And the inability to see that in a broader picture and to connect the dots of what we are seeing here being a symptom of a larger trend is hardly existing. Just very marginal groups of a couple of academics, a couple of very left-wing folks who understand that because out of their critical stance towards the state in the first place. Now, there are obviously immediate tools of defense to bring back justice to people who have been suffering, fighting in the court. But in the long term, I think there would be a necessity to abolish the counterterrorism state in itself. Right? A lot of the tools have been legalized, and a lot of what I've been talking about here in terms of anti-Muslim racism is state institutionalized anti-Muslim racism. It's not about like we have opinions and talk and this is far-right populism on the level of policy talk. No, this is laws we're talking about here. So there has to be a huge effort to fight back against a long time developed sort of legalization of many of these policies. And finally, anti-Muslim racism is a part of is a symptom of a larger picture of social injustice that we have to address. I don't want to go into details here, but I think that is also one of the main things to consider. A slight hope that I have is only on behalf of the capital. As long as money talks and the demographic change, which is real, also have to consider the needs of those people, that might be the only exit strategy. But again, it's not a real solution to the problem. It's only addressing some of the symptoms in terms of the ability of European societies to include Muslims, because at the end of the day, they're gonna have their Nikes and Adidas with the hijab and all that stuff, as well as all the others, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to speak just after Farid. So I'm not a scholar. I have been an activist, anti-racist activist in France, and also a journalist and a filmmaker. And my focus would be France and the very specific expression of Islamophobia in France throughout the use of certain principles from the French Republic. So this year, Paris has been at the center of global attention with the Olympics. The ceremony, as well as the games, gave a very positive image of France, of the diversity, of how we do coexist as a very diverse and multicultural country. But there were some people who were not invited to be part of the Olympics. French women, French Muslim athletes were not allowed to compete with the hijab, which was a new rule that was decided by the Minister of Sports, and which was very interesting because as French women couldn't compete with the hijabs, all the athletes from the rest of the world were allowed to do so, in the name of a principle that is called laïcité, that embodies the idea of secularism in France. Those women who are not representative from the states were dismissed their law to express their religiosity, representing their countries at the same time. So the principle of laïcité, which is the principle of secularism in France, has been created in a law that was voted in 1905 that doesn't include the word laïcité in itself, but that really established that principle. So it was first established, it was about guaranteeing freedom, and it instituted the separation of the churches and the state. And it included the free exercise of religion by French citizens, by people who live in France, and respect for all citizens before the law, regardless of belief. So the state is also supposed to guarantee your freedom of speech or freedom of belief. So secularism imposed neutrality on the French state and on public institutions, but did not require personal neutrality from the citizens. In 1989, two female students in high school decided to go, I think it was in middle school maybe. So they decided to go to school with the hijabs. They were Muslims, and it really started a national controversy on whether they should be allowed or not to go to school with the hijabs. At that time, the political landscape was divided, and on the left, the option was rather to support them in their right to go to school with a hijab. The then socialist Minister of Education considered that they should be allowed to do so, and the Supreme Court, the Conseil d'État, decided that as long as they were not promoting Islam, it was okay for them to go to school with their head course, because they were not part of the state. They are being served by the state, so they should not be forced to be neutral. Then 15 years later, the political climate is totally different. It's 2004, it's post 9/11, and the debate is again provoked by two students from high school who decided to go to school with a hijab, but the majority of the political landscape is in support of the ban of the hijab. So to me, it's a significant shift in the understanding of the secularism principle, because it requires users of state school to be neutral about religion, or at least discreet, because a law is framed as a ban of all conspicuous signs. So what is conspicuous is interpreted by the heads of school. So it includes headscarves, large crosses. So I've never seen anyone going to school with a giant cross, but I think that they need to make the law sound kind of echo. And but all the debate was focused on Islam, and it was all about the freedom of the possibility for Muslims to be visible. And what's interesting is that it struck very differently women and men. So having the same belief, men were not questioned, and boys were not questioned on their rights to go to school. But women were targeted, and they were actually watched in the way they were dressed. So I was part of a feminist movement at that time, and at that time in 2004, most of the mainstream feminist movement, white feminists I would say, supported that law. And that's really what started my anti-racist activism, because as a feminist, I couldn't accept to support a law that would disproportionately strike young girls and women. And to me, that desire to track markers of religiosity reflects an intolerance of Muslims that goes beyond targeting of women. And it's also something that is rooted into the colonial history. In the late 50s, in Algeria, that was colonized by France, public ceremonies were organized. It was public unveiling ceremonies that were organized in the streets to unveil colonized Algerian women. It was organized by the wives of the generals, so the militaries who were representing France in Algeria. And it was organized to promote assimilation. And it's very interesting to see that a very similar patronizing way of telling Muslim women how they should behave in order to look free and to be assimilated is also promoted by the same kind of white feminism that sees Frenchness and assimilation in a very narrow way. So that with those laws, there has been a very, very important evolution. And the last development of those interdictions was a new measure that was voted. It was not a law but a decree that was implemented last year by the Minister of Education. It was the ban of what we call the abayas. So the abayas are long sleeves dresses that come from the Middle East, and the Minister of Education banned them based on an extension of the 2004 law that says that anything that is not in itself religious but that can be seen as religious should be banned. So that really include many things. So what is an abaya? It's just a long sleeve dress. Any dress could be seen as an abaya. And so as a consequence, if a female student is seen as being Muslim and has a long dress that even she has bought in Zara or H&M, she's been seen as wearing a religious sign. And it's very interesting. I just read, I was telling you yesterday about the news I read last week. So there was a conflict in a classroom last week between a teacher and a student. So the student really behaved very badly. They slapped their teacher, and they beat the teacher over the teacher, asking them to not to wear their Islamic jacket. And I was like, what's an Islamic jacket? Like, is it Islamic because the person is Muslim, or is it green, or is it like, what does it mean? So I think that the fact that we interpret anything that is worn by a Muslim as Islamic, and that it's up to the heads of school or the teacher to interpret it, also generates conflict. It generates conflict, and it also singles out Muslim students. So those values, laïcité, universalism, the idea that the French Republic relies on the idea of universalism, so we are all the same, we're not supposed to look different in the public sphere, is a tool to me to assimilate and to erase all the differences and to present a very narrow idea of who is French and who is not, and how being French should look like. And also, it erases from the public sphere the visibility of certain types of Muslims. And those tools that are mostly claimed by the left are now used by the far right, which pretends to defend the French Republic, its principle, the French identity, in the name of laicity and universalism. And it's very interesting because the far right was created by people who were against the French Republic. And now they're just using all that ideology, that vocabulary that comes from the left to present themselves as the guardians of the French Republic against the Muslims who are supposed to be the ones challenging the Republic in its foundations. Um, and it's interesting I would like to go back to what you were saying about the security measures and the fact that we've had in France a state of emergency after the terrible attacks that happened in 2015 against Charlie Hebdo, and then in the Bataclan in Paris, but also in Saint-Denis. Everybody forgets always the fact that it also happens out of Paris in the banlieue. So the state of emergency was created during the colonial time, during the revolution, the Algerian Revolution. It was in the law supposed to last 12 days and to allow the police and the state to implement special measures without having the approval of the parliament. So that state of emergency that was supposed to last only 12 days was expanded from 2015 to 2017. And in the meantime, many people were struck by exceptional measures. So Muslims mostly, but also environmental activists, as you said. And some of that very special law was included in a law that was voted under Macron, under Emmanuel Macron in 2017. And in addition to that law, 2 security laws were voted, including the law against separatism that became the law promoting the values of the Republic, which allowed the state to basically make the main organizations who were in charge of fighting Islamophobia disappear. And the decree that allowed the dismantlement of those organizations is very interesting because one of the aspects of the decree, like you really should, if you read French, it'd be very interesting for you to read it. So one of the grounds, including including the fact that those organizations fight against Islamophobia was, I quote, cultivating the suspicion of Islamophobia within the French society. So, like on that ground, an organization that was founded to fight Islamophobia was dismantled because it was cultivating the idea that there was Islamophobia in the French society. So, even as a Muslim organization working to point out the fact that there is systemic racism and Islamophobia is a problem and can make the government explain why they wouldn't allow you to exist. And another organization was also accused of not properly managing the comment section of their social media. So it was also dissolved. And it's also interesting that you said that one of the very first moves of Emmanuel Macron was to make sure that he would organize the Muslim faith which is to me in opposition with the principle of laicity, because the government is supposed not to be involved in the faith, is supposed to guarantee the equality of the religions before the law, but not to be involved in how the faith is organized and how the Muslims, the religious leaders organize themselves. So the government pushed the French Council of the Muslim Faith to draft a charter to oversee the activities of the imams. And the document released 3 years ago is to me an incredible offense to the freedom of expression and association. One of its articles says that the denunciation of the so-called state-sponsored racism is defamatory. But as citizens were supposed to be allowed to say that there is state-sponsored racism in France, it's not something that is illegal. But they want the imams to be those official Muslims who carry the ideology of the government against Muslims who would be protesting against systemic racism. So that charter would prevent any imam from criticizing institutional Islamophobia. I think that what is also interesting is the fact that France is not only in Europe but also all across the world. It's the only country to be present on 4 continents. So it's it's not because we're open-minded, it's because of colonialism, of course. So it's a result of the fact that former colonies have been made into departments. And one of those former colonies is very interesting to me regarding the principle of laïcité. It's Mayotte. So I don't know if you're familiar with Mayotte. It's in the Indian Ocean. It was part of the Comoros, and now it's a French department. It's just, close to Mauritius. And it's 95% Muslim. And in Mayotte, there is a tolerance in the application of the Sharia. And as Mayotte is one of the territory which the largest movement of migration coming from the Comoros, the influence of the far right is very high. In each election, they vote for the far right on the first turn. And so the discourse of the far right there is very different. When Marine Le Pen goes to Mayotte, she says that the hijab is fine. It doesn't have the same meaning in Mayotte than it does in France. And it's very interesting to see that we tolerate the fact that the people from Mayotte they can use religious courts to manage some conflicts, and that the far right there is not that much Islamophobic because it's very successful. So I think that to understand how the principle of laïcité is flexible, we should also look France as a whole, not only in its European part, but also in the exception that they apply to the formerly colonized territories. I also think that the responsibility of the normalization of Islamophobia really comes from an idea that is very much rooted into the left, that people should be freed from religion. Instead, religion is seen very negatively. So the idea that we should be freed from religion is so deeply rooted into the left that the discourse tends to confuse laïcité and atheism. Like neutrality is seen as no religion, not having a religion is sometimes seen as an expression of laicity and secularism, which is not the case. I've seen many people, for example, saying that one should not express any religion, in the public sphere, which is not the principle of secularism. You are allowed to express your religion at any place as long as you don't disturb the public order. So your personal sphere is yourself, and you carry it wherever you go. So the confusion that there can be between atheism and laicity and secularism is also one of the reasons why Islamophobia is so normalized and so connected with the discourse and the misunderstanding that there is on laicity. So I think I'm going to stop here, and maybe I'm sure that you had many questions. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
All right, how about Marine Khan? Times. You know what? We have a roaming mic that's a backup, just in case. So
All right.
it's going to get good, friends. We've got some people with strong insights on these.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was super important. I think I'll do maybe a comment on the Brits, given that we haven't been part of this, to maybe a short history of where we're at, because we had some riots over the summer. So the idea that we're doing this well is I think is quite jarring to that image. And then I've got a question as well. So where is the UK at? So this is not comprehensive, but where I see the state of our Islamophobia is that it's evolved into what looks like a punching up kind of Islamophobia. So Muslims have been subject to the same kind of post 9/11 securitization, but ultimately maybe through force of numbers and generationally, we're a very established community, often from the subcontinent. Muslims have managed to become middle class in the UK. We have evolved from construction workers and taxi drivers to lawyers, accountants, doctors, politicians, most clearly and notably. And now we're kind of attracting the kind of existential dread from a working class, predominantly white male, population that sees Muslims as a threat now because of our visibility and our relative levels of success. And that's a different, more evolved form of racism. I guess the bad news is that if integration or whatever it looks like success in Europe means, that doesn't mean Islamophobia goes away. It just evolves into this other kind of broader threat. And this is the threat that I guess the Jewish communities in Europe have faced. A lot of this anti-Semitism is about this so-called punching up. They're doing well. We're not doing so well. So that, and there's other elements to it, but that's sort of where I see where the UK is at. And I don't really take that much pride in the fact that our racism has evolved, that people are Islamophobic because we're doing so well, because basically the counter narratives and the allyship and other parts of the political spectrum have been completely complacent about this issue for a long time, which is why you end up with riots. So that's sort of where we are, I think, in the UK. And then just maybe a question about the European level to this. Now, often when a lot of these things are happening domestically in countries, I think the reflex of lots of Europeans, anti-racism groups or European, in Germany or Austria and France, is to see the European Union as a kind of recourse against this nasty domestic securitization of Muslims. So they say that the European Union should be a bulwark. It should be a way to protect us as minorities. And I want to raise the abject failure of that as a expectation, and in reality how that works. Now, something I'm really preoccupied with is this idea of Europeanness, which has been gradually expanded from Western Europe to Southern Europe, from Protestant and Catholic Europe to Orthodox Christianity. Can the concept of Europeanness ever be expanded enough to include Muslims? Muslims born in Europe, Muslims who only know Europe. And it's interesting because I think the first popular use of the terminology Europe to describe white people in the continent is with an interaction with Muslims. So this is the Battle of Poitiers, where Charles Martel holds back the Umayyad forces, stops the colonization of Northern Europe by the Muslims. And that's the first time that these people start referring to themselves not as Carolingians or whatever, but as Europeans. That's where that word is born. And I think it's really special and important to understand that this is how Europeans first started identifying as Europeans when they faced the Hun, in this case, the Muslims. And so my question to you guys is that because I think the concepts of neutrality spill over from what happens in France, they are now basically constitutionalized in the European Union through decisions made by the European Court of Justice, primarily because of the hijab issue. So we're now actually developing a legal definition of neutrality, which for me is actually exclusionary to Muslims, to signs of Muslimness, and to the lived experiences of Muslims. And so I guess I want you guys maybe to be, can you be more optimistic than me about the role that the European Union can play and how we can legally start challenging this idea? Because I think once you set these things in stone, and Muslims are always the other, and the litmus test for being European is not being Muslim, I think it raises huge problems about what to do in all of these countries about their growing Muslim populations who are now no longer scared to show their Muslimness, and if anything, in defiance, are doing it more. And so I guess that's sort of where I'm at.
All right. A very short comment in regards to the British situation. I think, why I usually make this division is obviously not the national security state, because as you rightly pointed out, this is very much the same. And the UK was probably one of the most eager ones to join the global war on terror, which had ramifications also on a national domestic level. But what you said in terms of who the Muslims are in the UK determines a lot what spaces they have to fight back. And this is one of the most important differences to the rest of Europe, because Muslims are so heavily represented primarily as a working class people in the majority. They lack the resources, and I always said, when Trump was inaugurated, I was at Berkeley back then. People were saying, "Oh, I have to leave America. It's such a bad place." And thinking about Europe, I said, look, the thing is, when Trump is elected, what happens is people get on the streets, people organize. We have so many Trumps who might speak in a much more clever way and do not present themselves as such, but in terms of the policies are as harsh as he is. But there is no response, there is silence. And those who are victimized by these policies, they're just excluded, they are marginalized. And I think this is really what makes the British situation so different. In regards to the European issue, obviously when it comes to religion-state relationships, the European Union has a very clear policy, which is we leave it to the nation state. So they don't really have any sort of impact when it comes to the overall organization of state-church relations, which obviously has an effect on a direct effect on how Muslims can organize as in a religious manner in terms of their denominations. I think what has to be pointed out, and some of what I talked about here in terms of these attempts to the hawkish side of the attempts, which is to criminalize Islam, I think we have to be aware that this is coming out of a very specific kind of people, primarily conservative, Christian democratic political camp. And there are institutional efforts to make this the new normal in Europe. I had to search it up because it had such a weird German name. But then there is an institution that was established in 2020 when Sebastian Kurz was in power in Austria, called the Vienna Forum on Countering Segregation and Extremism in the Context of Integration. Only Germans can make something like that up, obviously. The important thing is it started off with 3 countries: Germany, France, Austria, and Denmark. In the meantime, it has 10 nation states of the European Union participating each and every year. Now, I don't want to overestimate this institution, but what they do is they bring 100 of pundits, experts, people from policy makers, not only ministers who talk the talk, but also bureaucracy who walk the talk and who implement these policies. They bring them together to exchange. How is the ghetto law doing in Denmark? Oh, great. And what about the anti-separatism law? And how are we going with the new Islam Act in Austria? And so on and so forth. They're having all of these discussions there. It's highly secretive. It's not an open public forum. People usually don't publish about it. But this is coming from the origins of Christian democratic, primarily CSU, Bavaria-based folks, of the Christian Social Union, together with their Austrian friends, who started off this sort of thinking about a new version of how we can cope with the Muslim issue. And I think this is one of the most extreme forms. The Friends are very much part of that from the beginning on. And what I fear is that what we're going to see in the near future is, because there is also participation from the liberals, participation from the social democrats, that they are trying to push that agenda. I don't see any other effort that is countering that and that is pushing for a more open European identity and pushing against these sorts of policies. And the other thing of my observation is that France is playing a big, huge role in trying to mainstream a lot of what they are doing on a national level, also when it comes to the European Council and to the European Commission. We have seen where there are so many examples where they have interfered in any sort of attempts to do some anti-racist work, right? And there is obviously like competing institutions here. If we take the Fundamental Rights Agency, right, that has just like 2 weeks ago published this great report of Muslims in Europe. But what do European institutions do after we have these results? We've been seeing these results since 20 plus years. But what has been the response? I don't see something that makes me really highly optimistic.
Just quickly, regarding the appreciation of the bills that are targeting Muslims by international institutions, like the Council of Europe described the bill on separatism as problematic in many respects, targeting and stigmatizing Muslims and indirectly suggesting a link between this group and foreign terrorist threats. That didn't have any effect. So they do their work, and in the same way as police brutality has been pointed out by those institutions, locally, the states doesn't really recognize the fact that one group is singled out and targeted by bills that really threaten their human rights. So, but I'm not that pessimistic. I think that there is a way to try to expose that at a European level, but we need to find it.
Shadi Hamid, who is a Washington Post columnist, Wisdom of Crowds host, Faith Angle advisor, TRT partner. We got to get a mic to him. I'm just filling the all around great guy.
Okay, good. Oh, thank you for those kind words. Yeah, well, first of all, Fareed, I do appreciate your pessimism. I mean, not all problems have solutions. So I guess there's that. I'm also reminded whenever we have a conversation about Europe, as Americans, I think it's important for us to remember that we think about our European friends as democracies that are somewhat similar to us. They are not in important ways. And basic rights and freedoms are not protected. Constitutions are not strong in the way that ours is. And I don't mean to say this as some kind of like American triumphalism or that we're better, although I think we are. But putting that as, I just think there is a pretty stark contrast. And even though I've worked on these issues for quite some time, I'm always struck by how certain things can happen in European countries, which I would associate more with countries like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco. They sound more like authoritarian states in some of these regards. But going to what I wanted to sort of raise to you, Fareed, and maybe push you on a little bit. And you're probably aware that I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective. You said earlier in your remarks that it's not about what Islam is, and that you don't see the religion part as being central. You see this as being about racism primarily. I think that if you look at other minorities in the European context who are other from the global South, but I'm thinking here how the far right talks about the Vietnamese, for example, as kind of model minorities. It seems clear that different minorities are treated differently. So then that raises the question of why is it that Muslims in particular are seen as more of a threat than other minority populations that are different in other ways? And this is where I think it's inevitable just to sort of recognize that what makes Muslims different is that their religiosity is visible. There's obvious markers of faith. I mean, we brought up the hijab, obviously, but that's only the most obvious example. Whether it's not eating pork, which might not seem like a big deal, but in France, that is a big deal in schools because of school lunches and that sort of thing. But also the fact that prayer is visible, that fasting is something that is obvious and visible, so on and so forth. And so then if you look at it from that perspective, then it's not a problem of racism as much as it's a problem of secularism. And I think it's more useful to look at it as a problem of secularism because then there is a solution to the problem. Mm-hmm. Racism doesn't really have a solution because people are racist. They look at people who are differently than them and they have a particular view. But if we see it as a problem of secularism, then there's actually policy changes that are possible. You can say, well, maybe countries like Germany, Austria, and France should broaden their conception of secularism to be less narrowly secularist and embrace more a public religiosity. Mm-hmm. And that public religiosity, being more comfortable with that, can allow Muslims more space in these societies. Now, obviously, it's difficult for a country like France to accept public religiosity, but it's theoretically possible over time. So I'm just curious how you would respond to that, if we can, is there something here where we can reframe the problem? Because ultimately, I think part of the issue with Islam, and I actually see this as a positive about Islam, other people see it as a problem, but one of the reasons I think Islam is such a vibrant religion is precisely because it is resistant to secularization. And I've written before about how I think that's at the very core of Islam. There is a kind of, it's secularism resistant. And we as Muslims take pride in that because obviously we don't want our religion to be diluted. We don't want secularism to overtake our religion and just make it like all the other religions and so forth. So if you take my premise, or if other people take my premise that Islam is secularism resistant, then again, it takes us back to secularism as being the main variable here. So I'd just be curious what your thoughts are.
Well, thank you. Very important question. Probably the way why, or one of the reasons why I don't necessarily see it through the lens of secularism is, first of all, let me speak about the Austrian case, which I'm very much familiar with, coming from Austria originally. It's a Catholic country. Religion is very visible everywhere. It's institutionalized in terms of holidays. Every courtroom you enter, every school, public building has a cross. Like, religion is part and parcel of everyday life. The way we speak, the way we talk, the remembrance of God is part of our vernacular language. So it's like Christianity is everywhere, right? The way how you coined the question of secularism, if I understand you right, is very much about the visibility of in everyday life, right? So yeah, we are obviously having, and Germany is probably very similar, especially the southern part of Bavaria. We have a separation of state and church, which does not go hand in hand with the separation of religion and society. Because in religion and society, it's a very strong entanglement that we can see. So the French case is a very anormal case for the overall European landscape in that regard. So even though there is a strong divide between the Protestant and the Catholic experience, I would say secularism, like if I go into details of how state church are structured, even the relationship between that, probably a lot of Americans would say this is not secularism. The way of how religion is privileged, how churches are privileged, how the state funds so many religious services, etc. So then the question is, if it's not about that, and if it's about having some visibility in the public space, there would be two options for the Catholics, or any other religious denomination, be it Christian and majoritarian, which is, one approach could be, well, that's cool, they're actually strengthening our religiosity, and we should jump on the same bandwagon and use that for our own religion. And I have heard that explicitly from clergy. Like, people who are pro-dialogue, they talk like that. Right? So they see in the religiosity, in the public visibility of religion of Muslims, something that strengthens their own churches. Right? And then there is, I would say, the fundamentalist, nationalist version that really believes that they are in a crusade. And I just wrote this one book in German where I went aside from my political science analysis and went into more of like stories telling of who those people even are, who do all of these policies. They are like Opus Dei folks. They are like super hardcore fundamentalist Catholics on the margin of Austrian society. So I don't see necessarily, and they see Islam as a threat, right? They are the ones who are behind these policies. This does not come out of the blue. It's like there is an ideological core that determines these sorts of problems that I've been describing here. And I feel like this is not the issue of secularism, because even if you look at them in terms of the way how they then practice religion, not necessarily very public. It's in a very hidden way. And I feel the way how they understand the crusade that they are in, this is something that has a lot to do with the racialization of religion. And I didn't go into historical details here, but obviously I think that is an important determinant of how Europe and European white Christian male identity sees itself, is at the backdrop of the exclusion of Jews and Muslims, who were until, like for a long time, the racialized other, which, and the strong distinction between race and religion is something that conceptually, I think, is not necessarily always helpful. I mean, I understand religion is something different than race, but the racialization of the religious other is the origin of the notion of race in its Spanish version as it occurred the first time in the 14th century in itself. Race meant blood and religion. That was the literal meaning in the Spanish original, and then transformed to what we now conceive of as race in a very coupled, in an understanding that is very decoupled from our understanding of what religion is. So that is how I bring that discourse together. So for me, the question, because even the question, of like, what is secularism? And can Muslims be secular, right? And are the Muslims actually more pro-secularism or against it? I think that's not, you don't have a clear-cut answer to that in regards to whether they would champion more of a separation of church and state or not. We don't have any polls, so I can't give you like a very clear-cut answer to that. But I doubt that Muslims are necessarily for less secularism in regards to state-church relations. And probably because many of them coming from authoritarian regimes, they might even opt for a much more stronger and stricter separation that allows them to live their religion free as far from authoritarian mingling of the state, right?
But isn't it different, though, if you define secularism more as the separation of religion from politics, and less so the separation of church and state or mosque and state? So if you use that distinction, then it looks a little bit different, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It may be easier to confront secularism public legally than racism, perhaps, as I heard you say. Okay, can we get one more roaming mic, our friends in the back? Can we go to Nicholas Pelham? Unless there's somebody in front of you in line, which there could be.
I think
Is the microphone working now? Oh, okay, great. I don't know. I don't think
I
so.
feel I'm under orders. Thank you for two excellent presentations. I thought there were kind of two, perhaps three elephants in the room. Well, maybe there were more, but there were two that struck me. One of which is kind of obvious, but was kind of skirted over, which is the kind of jihadist threat. Which, if that did come out of the mosques, it's hard to disassociate that from Islam and how Muslims are perceived. So, how should Western societies be dealing with that? The other kind of obvious one is Israel. And the events of the past year and how that has shaped how Muslims are being viewed generally, and kind of the polarization of politics along identity lines, and how sort of Jewish communities generally have responded in different ways, and how that affects, are they seen as being on the same page because the experiences are, on the surface similar, or are they opposite ends of the spectrum? And the third you touched on, but I'd like to know a bit more about, was the role of Arab states that also take a kind of certainly anti-Islamist line, and how that's affecting the debate in Europe.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
No, good.
Yeah? All right. That's big elephants. Well, I mean, the way I like to talk about the jihadi phenomenon is what I usually do, like, in public debates, etc., when people talk about that, is I try to emphasize that we have to see that phenomenon as a phenomenon that is not to be thought about and conceptualized outside of Europe. Not only, I'm not an expert in this whole literature on jihadism, radicalization, etc. And there's obviously a lot of different stories that can be told here. But I always find it quite interesting that a lot of the jihadi folks who are being recruited on European soil, going to Syria and other places, are very often people who have A, no clue about Islam, or B, sometimes extremely young. That has been especially the case in countries on the more Central European or more Eastern European side, who coming from the Balkans or are descendants of immigrants from Chechnya and these places. And a lot of them have very different motives of how they got into that in the first place. I followed a couple of court cases, a couple of narratives here and there. And what I like to emphasize is, yes, you have to talk obviously about the Islam part in that, but I think equally important, if not more important, is their whole story and socialization, where they come from, the grievances that inform them. There's clearly, some part of them where they grew up as Muslim, they have gone through a lot of racism, etc. Then there is these stories of people who come from a very different background. Whatever it might be, what we tend to is religionizing certain political events, which I try to push very hard against, not to fully exclude religion out of the debate, but really to put the emphasis in these political issues on the politics. And I think only if European countries see that as a problem they are themselves part of, they can tackle that, rather than excluding it and creating this kind of, this is an Islam-related issue, it's not our business, we can't really do anything about it other than, crack down on them and reform Islam the way I've described it. So that's just like a couple of thoughts here. In regards to Israel, I think the situation has deteriorated a lot. Look at Germany and what's going on there. This is insane, right? In terms of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and all of that. I find it, obviously, there is an equation that assumes that every Muslim who is publicly visible is automatically inclined to stand up against Israel. And this is also the logic in terms of the money flow that has funded a lot of the far-right anti-Muslim movements. The logic that is at the core of the argument that we have to do something about Muslims. Like originally, especially if you look into the US context, that swapped over to Europe, the European Foundation for Democracy and a lot of other think tanks that were funded by these right-wing folks in the States, in DC. The assumption was Muslims are a threat because they are a threat in the long term to Israeli security on the East Coast, if they do politics, right? That was the logic. And we can see that clearly playing out now after October 7th. Although I honestly, I did not do a comprehensive research on that, but I have the feeling that at the forefront of these protests are not necessarily the Muslims, especially not the organized Muslims. I get rather the impression that they are very silent. And probably part of that silence can be explained via the intimidation that is sent on behalf of the state. And I was visiting Europe this summer, and from the conversation that I had with a couple of people in different countries was that, this is the message they got. So behave well, nothing will happen. And that is also why we see probably more the Jews at the forefront of protests for ceasefire rather than the Muslims in the first place, in terms of organized people.
I mean, sorry, just to,
Yeah.
is Israel kind of whipping up some of the sentiment, and to what extent?
In Europe.
Yeah.
That's a long debate now. I mean, you know, when I always find it interesting. Now, we had this Amsterdam event, right? This week or the week before. And, you know, I think it's interesting if you observe, like, who's getting out there and who's the mouthpiece of framing this in a way that this is being seen primarily and only exclusively as an purely anti-Semitic act, as a form of pogrom, as it was called. Then you'll see that there's a bunch of people out there who are part of the network that is clearly in favor of Israeli politics, also the politics that is happening now. So I'm sure they are doing their part in order to assure that there is an unwavering support for the state of Israel in these days. I find it always interesting, you know, coming from a German-speaking environment originally and residing in the States and looking at what a huge difference there is in terms of the media coverage. And it's, you know, I think through an American lens, it seems almost absurd what you read in German news media, in many German news media when it comes to that topic. And that is clearly informed, I think, not only by what people try to point out many times, by the whole commemoration of the Holocaust and the legacy of the Nazi regime and the post-Nazi era that Germany and Austria have entered. But it's also, I think, a very deliberate change of the politics in the case of Austria, and the continuation of a politics that was already entrenched in the early days of Konrad Adenauer in the German case. In the Austrian case, it's very much the opposite. Austria was the first country to have the PLO as a quasi-embassy, right? So it has to do with the new leadership, I think, here in that case.
Friedrich, the contrast between the media coverage in the U.S. and Europe sounded interesting. And can you just say
Germany?
Yeah. You just say a little bit more about what you, what's been striking to you about that?
Look, just like one simple example. Like from day one on, you had on CNN folks representing the Palestinian voice. Well, you have to search hard to get a Palestinian voice in German or Austrian TV. Like the amount of coverage from Palestinian voices throughout the whole catastrophe that we have been going through the last 14 months is much, much more one-sided on the German-speaking side compared to the United States. I mean, I didn't quantify it, but I'm following news quite closely, so yeah.
Could I add to that? I'm feeling very strongly about that, and I agree with you, Farid. And I think maybe as a bit of context, I mean, Germany, for obvious historical reasons, has declared its support for Israel Staatsräson. It's a reason of state. It's a pillar of German post-war identity. And it's a word that Angela Merkel used for the first time in 2006 in the Knesset. In fact, she used it one year before at the UN, but nobody noticed. But then she used it in the Knesset, in this first speech of a German chancellor in the Knesset, and it became a thing. And then I think a second step should probably be added, which was the criminalization of the BDS movement. The Bundestag voted to declare that organization to be anti-Semitic, which means that everybody is now at risk of getting canceled in Germany. And with culture and academia being heavily dependent on public funding, it really is a massive clampdown on freedom of speech. And you get almost perverted situations where Jewish Americans will, like Masha Gessen, my colleague at the New York Times, I don't know if you saw, but she likened Gaza to the situation in Nazi-era Eastern European ghettos. And whether you agree with that or not, I mean, I think we can all agree you should be able to say that. Now, Masha Gessen was awarded a prize in Bremen after she made that comparison publicly in the New Yorker. The city of Bremen withdrew and the location was canceled. The people who gave her the prize said, no, you're still getting the prize, but like in a tiny location and stuff. People called her anti-Semitic. She is the grandchild of a Holocaust victim. I mean, this is the sort of situation we're in. And non-Jews are running these local organizations at a state level, which anti-Semitism councils run by German non-Jews who then decide what's anti-Semitic and not. I mean, in other words, Germany in some ways is so paranoid of forgetting the lessons of the Holocaust that it's forgetting the lessons of the Holocaust,
What's BDS movement?
Oh, how do you... Yeah.
American University.
Anyways.
Do you want to weigh in on this, Rokhaya,
Yeah,
as
just
well?
your question on jihadism. I think that the goal of jihadists is to draw a clear line, a clear separation between the so-called Muslim community and the Western world. So whatever the states do that push the Muslim communities on the margin is very helpful to the jihadists, to me. So because their interest is that the Muslims don't feel included, that they feel persecuted. So the more the states have exclusive measures, the more the jihadists has an argument to say that we're not welcome there and that we should have different spaces. So I think that they have no interest in Muslim being treated fairly and in Muslim asking for more inclusion. So it's not really helpful to create a suspicion against the whole Muslim communities when jihadis are promoting a separation between the Western world and their own idea of what the Ummah should be.
Can I suggest that we take a quick break? We have, when we come back, McKay Coppins, Rachel Donadio, Mattia Ferrarisi, Christina Lamb, John Rausch, Katrin Benholz. We've got lots more to do. Let's take a 10-minute break, which really means 15, and then be back. All right. How about to McKay Coppins from The Atlantic?
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you both for your presentations. I thought they were fascinating. Obviously, since everybody has a question, I'll try to keep mine brief. You both spoke a little about the tension on the left in Europe between what's kind of an ostensible commitment to anti-racism and what you view as a secularism that kind of maybe veers toward hostility toward religion in general. And I'm curious if you see, you spoke, for example, about the kind of white feminist reaction to the hijab ban in the early 2000s. Have you seen any movement in the last 20 years in one direction or the other? Is anti-racist, if there's kind of a tug of war between anti-racism and secularism, has the left kind of moved one way or the other? And then related to that, I'm wondering a little about the far right's attitude toward Islam as it relates to religion in general. Obviously from an American perspective, the far right movements are very overtly religious. They're evangelical Christian for the most part, but they have to contend with the fact that they're so much of their movement is about religious freedom, and while there's still plenty of Islamophobia baked into their movement, it's a tension there. But I'm wondering if the far right movements have the same kind of interest in religion or even a concept of religious freedom. So.
Thank you. So yeah, I was mentioning the fact that in the early 2000s, feminist movement were more into the idea of freeing Muslim women from Islam, because the mainstream discourse was that the fact that they were supposedly affected by a very specific form of patriarchy, and that they didn't make their way to be emancipated in the same way as Western women, which to me was not true, but it was the mainstream, way of approaching them and kind of patronizing them in guiding them into freedom. And I would say that it has changed with the renewal of the feminism in the 2010s, and especially the post-Me Too and younger generation of feminists. They are more inclined into intersectionality, and even in the public representations, for example, in posters that promote protests or marches, they always try to include many different faces of women, including visibly Muslim women. So I'd say that today there is a divide in the feminist movement over mostly two topics, like maybe three. So the Me Too movement was not really welcome in France at the beginning. And then there is, I would say that the two main divides are like Islam, like Muslim women, and sex work. It's like those are the two lines. And the younger generation is more inclined to accept diversity in the movement. And I'd say that the younger generation of French people tend to think that secularism is restrictive to freedom of expression. And I'd say that there is also an influence of the public representation, the international public representation. Many of the young people watch series on Netflix, and they don't understand why people can go to high school with hijabs everywhere in the world, but in France. And so that also shape a different views on what is allowed or not. And regarding the anti-racist movement, there is something very specific to France that I was telling you about. It's the fact that in the early 80s in France, there was a march against racism and for equality that was started by an occurrence of police violence. And it was very successful, but most of the people don't really remember it. But at that time, the socialist government decided to create an institutionalized anti-racist organization, which name is SOS Racisme, that kind of became the face of official anti-racism without having grounds with the grassroots movement. And that organization has been supportive of all the institutional banning of religious expression. So you also have a divide between the anti-racist movement that are funded by the state and the grassroots movements that are that have a different discourse and that tend to oppose the state and to consider that there is systemic racism. But it's also generational. I'd say that like feminists who are my age or more are mostly like against that freedom of expression, and the younger ones are, have different views.
I'll keep it very short on the rather political level. The tension for the center left is that on the one hand, they are traditionally representing the blue-collar worker, therefore tend to be anti-immigration because that's a threat, and that's especially the unions within the social democratic camps. On the other hand, they are not necessarily anti-racist. I think from my observation, they're always like individuals who care about these issues deeply, but it's not a strategy that is all-encompassing for the whole party. The more you go to the left, let's say a primary example would be Die Linke in Germany, they are probably those who have also included an anti-Muslim racist agenda, like pushing against anti-Muslim racism, right? As to the far right is historically, traditionally anti-clergy, anti-religion, anti-established church. They have embraced religion as part of a marker of their Christian, racialized white identity, and included the whole narrative about the defense of Christian Europe in their discourse. At the same time, as much as the far right has always been able to include a couple of Jews, they have also been able to include a couple of Muslims. And there is actually a very, very new trend that we just see starting right now, that far-right populist parties try to include even the long-established Muslim immigrant populations against the more new-coming immigrant Muslim populations.
Great, beautiful. Rachel Donadio with Atlantic, New York Times, and now running a cool thing in Italy.
Yeah, New York Times Atlantic. I'm not running a cool thing in Italy. I'm curating programs at the American Library in Paris. But anyway, I move fast, Josh. I'm hard to keep up with. I have a couple observations. First of all, thank you guys both very much for these really rich and thoughtful presentations. I live in Paris and became French. I'm an American Jew. Having become French, I shouldn't introduce myself as an American Jew, but I have a couple different observations here. One, I think that this principles of the Republic and the fight against secularism in France, this bill that was passed is such a hugely complicated measure, and it's clear that the intersection of national identity and national security issues are really complicated in France in a way that perhaps they're not in other places, and that this bill does in some ways overstep what traditionally the state has done. I mean, it's not supposed to police religion, but that's what it's doing. On the other hand, there's a much larger political context for this and practical questions which this French state and other states are facing, which is, how to push back against the influence of Turkey and funding the Muslim Brotherhood, which is funding some imams who are preaching things. So it's all in this larger, complicated context. I have one other observation, and then I do have a question. I think it's really interesting, Rokai, what you're saying about generational split and how these questions of secularism are seen. There are a lot of young hijab influencers on Instagram, and I think that there's going to be movement in that way. I actually think that one of the things that would push the debate about the headscarf most is maybe Emily in Paris should get a commission. She wants to take on a client who wants to sell the hijab, and her boss has to explain why in France we can't do that. I think that I'm waiting for that maybe in the next season. But my question is really,
Rome, sadly.
I know,
Sorry,
but
spoiler
it's
alert.
true. So she has to avoid the questions of secularism. But my question is really just a basic one. There are issues. It's clear, as you've talked about, that the far right has no problem in asserting a sense of national identity that's Christian identity, that's a European Christian identity, that the left has trouble competing in that ground. It doesn't really want to engage in these questions of religion, national identity, and that is a problem, I think, or a challenge facing the left and the center left across the West. My question is a basic one. Where actually in Europe do you think is the best place for Muslims to live and have the most inclusive, to feel like they're most welcomed and able to live the kind of lives that they want to live? Thank you.
You want to start, Kokaya, with Frank?
Go ahead. Just the part about the left not being able to draft a clear discourse on how. I think that like the far right, yes, really use. It's not like explicitly using Christianity, but mostly tradition and identity, and also using the idea of the Great Replacement, that racist theory that says that. Muslims are supposedly coming from Africa to replace the original indigenous white population, and it's just coded to say that the original identity of the continent is threatened by Muslims, not only who are already there but also the ones who are coming, and maybe the fact that the far right is so successful makes part of the left uncomfortable in having a very explicit discourse celebrating how we really are. And the part of the left that does so is labeled radical and also is seen as trying to gain votes, but in an insincere way. So that's also a problem. Like, it's very difficult to have a public discourse just saying who we are as a very diverse country without being suspected of just trying to manipulate the Muslim voters and just not really having the will to to unify the population. And about your question, I don't have an answer. I don't know where. Maybe there's a place that would be interesting. It's the Reunion Island, which is a French department in the Indian Ocean. So it was built out of slavery, and so after the slavery was abolished twice. So it was abolished first, like in France, it was abolished twice because we sometimes struggle to enforce human rights. So after the abolition of slavery, migrants came from South Asia to populate the island. So there is like the culture in the Reunion Island is very diverse. There is a strong population community, and when the law was proposed in 2004 to ban the religious sign, they didn't want to enforce it. They wanted to have an exception in the Reunion Island. And I think it's also interesting because the Muslim community is not a working class community. It's more similar to the UK. So you have a strong, because many of them were into trade, into business. So you have a strong Muslim community that is represented in all the various places of the social ladder. So I think it's a very interesting place, very small, but that's a nice place to live as a Muslim.
Very quick. We don't do rankings in our European Islamophobia report, but there's definitely one country where we have a hard time finding even authors working on Islamophobia in that specific country, which is Portugal, which has been Portugal for a long time. Probably with the establishment of a typical far-right populist party, that might change in the upcoming time. As for the first question, I just want to push back against your assumption that was more of a side note in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Turkish state. I think European policymakers totally overestimate the impact of the Turkish state. And the Turkish state's role is part of what I described before as embassy Islam, which is, a funny thing because as long as they were staunch secularists, they were fine with them. And as soon as the AKP got in power, it's a problem. Nevertheless, totally overestimated in my understanding, but we might differ depending on a detailed discussion. As for the Muslim Brotherhood, according to AIPAC, Ilhan Omar is Muslim Brotherhood, Rashida Tlaib is Muslim Brotherhood. Every person who is politically engaged in the public sphere as a Muslim is Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was the main argument in the anti-separatism law, and that was used. The real Muslim Brotherhood is state-centered. The real Muslim Brotherhood appeals to the state. That's the origin of its history, and that's the politics they play in Europe. The real Muslim Brotherhood are the collaborators for the European governments to play the game of the good Muslims that I described before as being one strategy vis-a-vis the other strategy, which is cracking down on the opposition. So Muslim Brotherhood is not a problem. Muslim Brotherhood is a discursive strategy to a catch-all phrase to go against everybody who seems to be a problem. That's how I see it.
Mattia Arisi from Domani.
I'm typically a strict follower of the Nicholas Pelham rule, so I would defer to. But if you give me the floor, I will go. I'm sorry for that. I'm just saying. Usually, that's not what I do. Yeah, no, exactly. Culturally, I think.
So well mannered.
So I do. Being Italian, speaking of which, being Italian, I am. No, thank you for this first. It's extremely interesting. Being Italian, I'm keenly aware, how religion shapes society and civil norms in both subtle and obvious ways. So I do understand a lot, and it's part of a general concern that I have. That does not mean that I'm persuaded more by the sort of hard secular model, which is still even less satisfying for me. Having said that, two different things. One is about the atheism of the 90s. Yesterday, I think it was brought up as a side note, the example of Richard Dawkins. I do see that growing, that position in which people advocating for like strong secularism and like sort of like pushing back against Christianity from a very rationalistic standpoint are moving in a different direction, sort of like becoming appreciative of a society that has been molded by sort of like Christian values and stuff like that, albeit not becoming Christian themselves, but sort of moving in a different position as sort of like cultural Christian or like appreciating Christianity from a civilizational standpoint, kind of like with some implied, I think opposition, of course, to other religious traditions, right? I wonder if you see that happening, or it's just me that, like, from in the last 25 years is seeing those shifts among intellectuals and other people. I'm not talking about like a hugely popular movement. It's more like an intellectual kind of trend. Maybe I'm the only one seeing that as a trend and not just small episodes. Completely different. So I wonder what you think about this. Completely different, and this could be another elephant, maybe a baby elephant in the room, but I'm not sure. Thinking about the rhetoric of the far right, or in general, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-everything in Europe, a common argument, a recurring argument, is about reciprocity. And it will be invoked the idea that Muslim communities and communities in general of minorities are asking for rights and space in public life that in Muslim majority countries are not granted in the same way to other faiths. It does not escape me the fact that this can be weaponized and instrumentalized as a rhetorical tool. At the same time, I'm wondering, can we like being completely oblivious about that? Can we be like completely like say, oh, this is not a problem. It does not imply anything, or like the sort of this idea of sort of being. I mean, having reciprocity in mind is completely wrong and stupid, or there is a valid point in that.
Very shortly to your second point, I think it's not a valid point. And the reason being is the assumption of a lot of, the first time I encountered this argument of reciprocity was from more folkish nationalist politicians. And the underlying assumption is obviously that Muslims are not really part of the European societies, because they are being imagined as, in one way or another, members of a different nation state where you don't have religious freedom, for instance, right? So in terms of how do we envision a liberal democracy to work, it should give the same religious freedom no matter what to any kind of religious minority that is in that country. So that's how I would strongly argue against any sort of reciprocity in the argument, which does not deny the fact that there is a problem in other countries with religious freedom. But to make one dependent on the other, I think is just a wrong way of approaching that question.
Yeah, on that point, I totally agree with that. Like asking to European Muslims to be responsible from what happens in other countries from which that sometimes they don't even have any relationship with is also participating in the fact of othering them. Like, why would they be responsible from something they have nothing to do with? And the idea that Muslim countries would be all the same is also very simplistic, because what do you call a Muslim country? Is Senegal a Muslim country? Senegal is 95% Muslim, it's secular, the first president was Christian, so why would Senegal be picked rather, why would Saudi Arabia be picked rather than Senegal or any other country in which the population is in majority Muslim? So I think it's still like it's the same rhetoric when you have like European Muslim women who wear hijab, and people would say to them, why would you wear that in the same time as Iranian women, Afghan women are trying to get rid of that. The center is you have to be able to decide whatever is good for you as a woman, whether it's to wear hijab to cover yourself, or it's to just have no, nothing on your head. You don't want to cover yourself. So it's the fact of seeing you and connecting you with other country is also diminishing your European citizenship.
Right. No, I see the validity of this point. At the same time, I think Farid gave us a great description of how Austria is a Catholic country, being a secular country. So I think it's not impossible to describe something that is culturally informed by religion, even in a secular setting, in terms of like being a lay state and stuff like that, right? So I think the Farid description of how Austria is sort of like infused with like Christian ideas is totally valid, and that I wouldn't have a problem of like applying that to other countries, right? The same logic. So to respond to your point, do you have any answer on my first question?
Short question, yes, I see that, and I think Luke yesterday spoke a little bit about that, from what I understood, right?
Yeah.
You gave the Dawkins example.
Great. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Because you only mentioned that very briefly, right?
Yeah. There's a very good podcast series which tracks it. I've written on it. It's both in America and in this country. So
I'll ask you the details, thanks.
sorry. The trend around people who kind of from coming out of the new atheist movement, who are either becoming Christians, actually converting. Russell Brand being a recent one, baptized in the Thames by Bear Grylls. But then also Richard Dawkins being a case of those who are formerly members of the New Atheists kind of identifying as cultural Christians. Often it's framed with an anti-Islamic element to it and an anti-wokester element to it.
Beyond Hasiadi is
And yes, she's a that's it.
Yeah. Secularism, civilization words.
Sure.
She was a very prominent member of the kind of New Atheists, sat on lots of platforms with Hitchens and Dawkins. But this is right across the board, and kind of lots of internet New Atheist YouTubers now becoming Christians and stuff. So it's a whole thing.
It's great. Let's go next to Christine O'Cran from France Culture.
Well, first of all, thank you to our speakers, and congratulations to Rokhaya in particular, because you were very precise and very factual about a very complex legal system which has been built in France. So maybe just one additional remark and a question. My additional remark is that historically, and I think it's very difficult for our American friends to understand that, secularism in France in 1905 was and has been to protect the state from the Catholic Church. In the US, as I understand it, the Constitution is to protect churches from the state. And I think that basic distinction makes it, again, culturally speaking, a divide when it comes to using the same words to actually describe very different phenomena. So I have a question to our Austrian friend, Farid. I have a great admiration for a country which makes us all believe that Mozart is actually Austrian and Hitler a German. I think it's an extraordinary...
Masters of deception.
When you say that it was a kind of division of labor, that our European governments would have imams and preachers actually paid by Algeria or Morocco in the case of France. Don't you think it's always been a way for these very regimes to keep hold of their own constituencies in Europe and indeed exercise political control?
Sure, it's a win-win game.
Sorry?
That's a win-win game for both states, yeah? There's an agreement.
Do you think there's as much manipulation on both sides? That was historically, at least in France,
Yeah.
the case. And again, I think that for us in Europe, and not only in France, the basic difficulty is that Islam, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Ummah, there is no distinction between faith and the state, between religion and the state. It's one and the same. In our traditions, there's always been a distinction between faith, religion, and the state. And so, hence, any discussion having to do with the political and social role of preachers in mosques, when some of those are translated, they are political speeches, more so than they are about religion. And especially in countries scarred by terrorist attacks, as indeed is the case of France, you cannot help but society as a whole, Muslims included, to be fearful of such politicized messages from people who are supposedly there to preach their faith. So I think there too, not stressing upon terrorist attacks and the scars in our societies is something which, in my view, was a little bit missing, if I may say so.
Yeah, I mean, probably because I just don't see it that way. I mean, first of all, we have to go back to the Cold War era, right? And in which the United States, as the main contender vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, was basically following the agenda to support an apolitical reading of Islam, primarily through the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to spread around the globe. Right, so that's also why we see all of these Islamic centers around the globe and in European capital cities, etc. So this embassy Islam, as I said, was a win-win situation, obviously, for both, right? The Muslim majority countries were happy that they could control their folks also through the religious sphere. I'm sure there's a lot of intelligence community included in there. And the other way around, the European governments were happy that they would take care of them. Now, having said that, I strongly disagree with this idea of the unification of state and faith. I think it's historically wrong to depict it as such. It's much, much more,
yes.
I think the tension, like, even when we speak about state the way we do it now, in terms of the nation state, is basically a Westphalian construct, right? It's a very new phenomenon, a couple of 100 years old. The idea of the political order and its combination with religion, if that is what you were talking about, I would say is also much more complicated. Actually, when you said that it has always been so, that that the imam basically serves this unification of the faith and the state, then this is something that is very much intertwined with the post-colonial era, in which the nation state that was built on the basis of following the European colonialism actually institutionalized the formerly organized endowments to become a subsection of the state authorities. And this new framework allowed the state to use religious institutions for its own sake. So it's a very new phenomenon in that sense, right?
But sorry, isn't it the very definition of Islam dating back to the Prophet?
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
look,
okay.
I mean, even if you look into Islamic theology, and I'm a layperson in that regard.
I think what I said, I'm saying definitely.
Hit that button. What do you mean?
So I think maybe the conflation is here between what is the state and political power. So I think what we've come to see as political power, the unit of measurement is the state. and that is a strong, big post-Westphalian state. So Islam's relationship with political power, because the Prophet was not only just a prophet, but he was a leader of a nation, but often those nations where people he was ruling over were not even Muslim majority. They eventually became people that were non-Muslim. So I think the exercise of power in Islam is not coterminous with how we see it in the West, as in it's a form of exerting state power. So the idea of having a ministry for religion or a state-controlled judiciary, that these are things where the state has instruments. Islam's historical evolution of power has been very different, often very diffuse, far less centralized. Yeah. So I think that's where there's this often misunderstanding that Islam always means political Islam, and that means using the state to promote or protect Islam, promote Islam, and that's just not. I don't even think it's native to the Islamic tradition. This is very much we're speaking about we're on European terms when we're talking about how Islam works with this. So that's why I don't think that Islam itself doesn't have the meaning of the Ummah. It probably means submission, if it means anything.
Well, the first Ummah that existed was the Ummah of Jews and Muslims, right?
Yes,
so it was not
Medina.
was not a religious notion. But this is the way how we usually refer to that. So it's not a big mistake, because that's the problem of how we think about Islam. And the fact that I'm not a theologian, but the fact that Muhammad was kind of, I don't want to say a statesman, but a political leader as well as a prophet, does not necessarily give a clear answer to what that means. Was he a prophet, a statesperson because he was a prophet, or although he was a prophet? And there is a lot of theological debate about these issues, right? And what that means in terms of the political institutionalization of religion or not, right? And but yeah, that's a totally different debate. I'm just saying I don't agree with these basic assumptions. So that's why we can't talk about this in that way. But in terms of the reality of the post-colonial Muslim majority nation state and its cooperation with the European state, coming out of the Cold War, coming out of this history after colonialism, it's a win-win situation. But this is a question of power, first and foremost.
Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times.
Thanks. I've waited so long. Most of my questions have been answered, but thank you for that presentation. It's a very important issue. Both of you spoke from the point of view of what states are doing and the majority population. I wanted to ask you about the role of Muslim leaders themselves. I was like Nick, surprised that you didn't mention the jihadi issue, because I don't think you can talk about Islamophobia without that. Shadi, you said why Muslims regarded as a threat in a way that other communities aren't. Well, unfortunately, since 9/11, we have had a series of major attacks which people have carried out supposedly in the name of Islam. So I didn't think that it's a surprise that there is a fear in communities because of that. And also, obviously, the way that that's been handled with the war on terror, the use of securitization, programs like Prevent in the UK, has made things much worse and created this sort of Islamophobia. But it struck me right from the start after 9/11 happened, because I had mostly been reporting in Muslim countries and living in Muslim countries, I was living in Pakistan before that. I found it really difficult as a journalist at that time to get any moderate Muslim leaders to speak out. So the people that ended up speaking out on our TV screens in the UK, but I think in Europe and in the US, tended to be extremists, radicals who didn't actually represent what most Muslims thought in their country. And I think that's a huge problem, that Muslim community doesn't have the kind of people speaking out for them that it should be. And so I wanted to ask you about that, the sort of that side, what they should be doing.
You mean speaking out against Islamophobia, or to
just generally? I mean, we still, the people that
against
speak
terrorism?
out most about Islam tend to be people who are representing a more extreme form of Islam.
Like, if it's about the terror attacks, ever since there has been an attack in France, and France has been really badly hit, all the Muslim organizations that I can think of have issued statements. So I'm not sure about what they should do more than what they can do. Like I haven't seen any religious figure being silent on that very specific issue. So I don't really know what they should do more than, just publishing official statements and whenever they're in a public sphere saying that they condemn the attacks.
I do just mean about terror attacks, and I do think that's a problem because I do, I personally found it. I had so many friends who were in the Muslim community who were in leading positions who would not speak out after 9/11 because they didn't want to be attacked by others. So, but I'm talking about generally, you are both coming at this from the point of view of what the state's doing, what the majority community, and I'm asking you, where is the ownership from the Muslim community in this? What should faith leaders be doing?
I'd say to my point of view, it's very difficult to speak. Like I can't think about any Muslim figure who's been vocal, especially on Islamophobia, who hasn't faced backlash. Like it's even myself, if I take my own example, I'm constantly accused of being supportive of, the worst radical form of Islam. So I can't think in France of any Muslim person who is still in the public eye and who is vocal against Islamophobia. You face much backlash. So I think it's also a message that is sent to, the majority, that if you speak up, you will be labeled in very negative ways. And also the fact that the government has tried to control the imams and what they should be able to do, and the fact of, being vocal against systemic racism is defamation to France, is also putting, the Muslim people in the position of always showing gratitude to the country that has supposedly welcomed them, even if they were born there, even if their parents were born there. For example, So it's yes, to me it's very, very difficult. I've been in 3 different trials this year for various reasons, but most of it has to do with the fact that I'm Muslim and I speak about Islamophobia. And there was, I just can share about that case, a very famous philosopher. I was on a TV set with him. And I've been very critical against Charlie Hebdo before the attacks, and I signed an open letter against them years before. And after the attacks happened, I was one of the people who were accused of, having built that climate that ended up to the attacks. And that philosopher said to my face that I provoked the death of the 12 of Charlie Hebdo and that I armed the terrorists. So he said that, you can Google the clip. And I sued him, and I lost. So it's my reputation is damaged by that statement, but there is nothing I can do.
Take another lawyer.
My lawyer is very good. It's William Bourdon, so I don't know. I think it's and the trial was also very interesting because it really lasted 4 hours, and the purpose was to demonstrate that it was credible to think that my writings could have influenced the terrorists, and we know that they wouldn't listen to a woman. So it doesn't even make sense.
Very shortly, the reason why I think I can and I should speak about Islamophobia, Islam in Europe, without speaking about jihadism is one. We can speak about whiteness without speaking about white supremacism. And the reason I'm very state-focused, I'm a political scientist, that's what interests me, not to deny the agency of grassroots levels activism. But when in Norway, Breivik killed 51 people, the reaction of the political elite was, let's hold our hands together, all the faith leaders, all the political parties, and stand for peace. A great answer, great response. When some Muslim jihadi guy does something, expand the security counter-terrorist state, increase law enforcement, and so on and so forth. So there is a different reaction to different things, right? And when we think about white supremacism and white supremacist violence, We don't think that we have to speak about the problematization of whiteness at large. We do think that when we speak about Islam and jihadism. And it's an inability to separate these things. And I think that is a problem in its core. And the reason for that is because one sort of violence is racialized and the other not. The other is just simple violence of a crazy dude, lone wolf, whatever story that we have in the narrative. The other one is, well, that's jihadism.
Yes,
terrorism.
but these people are carrying out those attacks saying it's in the name of Islam. So
yeah, whatever they do. I mean, so what?
Yes. But
Breivik
Breivik
wanted
also was
to
in the
defend
name
white
of
Christian European identity, calling it 2063.
I would
right?
just add very quickly, like, I have a general policy of not condemning terrorist attacks done by Muslims for like the last 10, 12 years, because it should go without saying that I'm against terrorism. The idea that Muslims are expected to condemn terrorist
you're
attacks
confusing
is...
my question. It's because I said about 9/11 and the fact I couldn't get people to speak out. I gave that as an example. My point is a general point, not about people coming out and condemning terrorist attacks. I'm asking, isn't there some role for Muslim leaders in this? We're looking at this issue just from the other side.
Yeah.
But I think
And I want to address that as well, because I think that's a valid point. And again, we had a conversation yesterday on the dinner table. Like and you know probably more than any one of us here in this room what that means in terms of the Afghan and Pakistani Muslim leadership that you have covered so well throughout more than a decade or so. So the one thing that we shortly mentioned was like, where were the textbooks for the Taliban created? At the University of Nevada, right? All of this has to be seen in a larger context of the Cold War and the deliberate support of a very apolitical but super conservative religious reading of Islam that was spread throughout the globe. And that's where we are. When MBS was visiting the United States, he was asked, like, what do you do about Wahhabi Islam? And he said, well, the US wanted us to do that. That's what we did it. Now you don't want, we're not going to follow up. And it's very honest, his response, because it was a collaboration between the KSA and the USA in that regard. And here we are. Now they are now complaining that all this Salafi interpretation of Islam that is spread around the globe that was not there before is now creating troubles in marrying with other ideologies to become the jihadi version, which is true. That's how it is. I definitely do not deny that. And maybe some people would push back and say, okay, but we can always go into history. We have to recognize all of that, what happened, to understand where we are, even if I don't have the solution how to do something else and get out of the problem.
All right, very good. We've got Katrin Benhold, Emma Goldberg, John Decker, Bruno, Maureen Connell. See how many we can get to? Katrin Benhold from the New York Times, you're up.
So Nicholas brought up 2 elephants in the room, and I want to add a third. And I want to preface this by saying that I'm already scared of saying something wrong and being accused of bigotry. I have safe space. Hear me out.
It's Cap Ferrat.
There we are. Yeah, exactly. The liberal elite in Cap Ferrat. So we've been talking about Muslims as a threat, a jihadi threat or whatever, perceived as a threat by various groups in society. And I want to add one layer to the, you actually touched on this, McKay, when you brought up feminism and the sort of concern that perhaps, the hijab was anti-feminist, anti-women, and that was one reason why the left, was against it and so on. I want to talk about something broader that I noticed in my reporting, mainly in Germany, but also in France and other countries, where in very diverse towns, and there's now several of our towns in our European countries that are turning majority-minority. So they're no longer white majority towns, but with recent memories of being white majority towns. The white minority feels threatened, not necessarily in a security sense, but actually in a sort of cultural sense. They feel, and maybe understandably, that their way of life is changing, their streets are changing, what's in the grocery store is changing, and what their children are being told by their peers in school might be changing. Perhaps it's no longer okay to have sex education, or at least you have some parents lobbying against that, with girls and boys in the same classroom, the question of swimming lessons together, all these issues. Now, of course, as a liberal democracy, you are committed in a way to be pluralistic and include illiberal views. And liberals don't like that very much. And so we're sort of at this paradoxical moment where people, I think, are grappling with it. But I think and it's easy enough to say, well, tough. This is a liberal democracy. This is the way it's going, and the majority wants this, and we obviously protect the right of the minority, but there's a kind of dominant culture evolving that this minority that is the native and the longest, the one that's been here longest, doesn't like very much. It's just tough. But I think we would be making a mistake to just not, to sweep it under the carpet, not talk about it, which is why I think it's sort of an elephant in the room these days. So yeah, what do we do with this cultural piece, the cultural threat piece? To what extent is the freedom of maybe a more conservative religious group that hasn't been native to that culture for forever, even though maybe for 1 or 2 generations, is actually changing social norms? To what extent is their freedom to do that superior within a liberal democracy to perhaps the freedom of what was a cultural majority to not have to even ask the question? I mean, of course we do PE together, and of course we have sexual education, and it's not even a question. It wasn't a question in 1980s Germany. So when white girls are bullied, and I'm not saying this is, and I would love to see data actually, because it's of course being instrumentalized and blown out of proportion, presumably by the far right. But I also know it is actually happening, that LGBTQ people, that women are bullied more in majority minority contexts where perhaps more conservative religious groups, and they tend to be more Muslim in Germany, now dominate the local culture. What do we do with that? Where does the freedom of one stop? And how does liberal democracy accommodate this?
I would point out that Shadi introduced some of us to his friend Eric Kaufman 8 years ago. I think, John, you were there at your house, and he spoke here on this very topic. I don't know if you've seen that one or not, but that's a right in the sweet spot. It's an 800-page book.
Yeah. I heard most of it. Let me try to give a very brief answer. One observation, and we have data on something which is slightly related to that. I just published a book this April, Politicizing Islam in Austria, on the rise of the far right in the 21st century, where we, on the one hand, analyzed a couple of policy fields, and the last chapter was huge data on the question of how Muslims, how the overall population relates to all of these politicized questions in regards to Islam over the time. And the good thing is we had such a long period of time that we could look at in which these policies were implemented and how that had also had an effect on the overall discussion. So the interesting thing is, because you obviously, when you speak about urban spaces in which you have larger populations of color, including Muslims, one of the things that we see is that the younger generation is actually the least biased, least prejudiced one, which is interesting because as you know, in a lot of German, French, Belgian, whatever metropoles you go to, you will find that the classrooms are, if not the majority is Muslim or people of color, then at least a huge chunk of 30, 40%. So what does that say, right? What does that tell us in terms of what you referred to yesterday? You introduced this idea of conviviality, of this living together in shared spaces and, seeing differences, but, having a way of living with each other, right? The more you go on the countryside, the more prejudiced people are. And that's obviously the places where you have least contact. So we tested basically that contact theory in regards to does that make any change? And the evidence is clear. The younger, the more urban, not necessarily the more educated, is more open. Which brings me to an interesting question, because you talked about something that is highly politicized these days, which is the school space, right? We have all these reports by white teachers saying, I'm being harassed, they don't accept my authority as a woman, and all of these discourses are floating around in German-speaking media all across, since years. I don't necessarily always know what I should think about that. You know, I'll give you just one example. There is a guy in Austria that has written a famous book. He was a former principal of a middle school or something like that, speaking about the huge problem of Islam, and this is the biggest challenge. And he speaks about his own memoirs, his own giving examples of what he has been through. I'm not sure if it's factually true. I mean, what I see is that this guy is connected to Washington, D.C.-based think tanks of the far right. He's presented to the public as a random guy who is just like a principal of a school. But it's more than that. I don't buy these stories, honestly. Also because, you know, I have been to school. My wife is a teacher. She has been teaching in public school. Stories that I get are totally different. And the question is not that I don't deny the very experience of teachers, even his own experience. But I very much question the way how he interprets them. Because if you have a racial bias, the way you see reality is a different one. Like, look, I've been out there in this German-speaking crazy world for 2 decades, public speaking, blah, blah, blah. I have people come across me with the weirdest allegations. That I was a Jew, that I was Mossad, that I was CIA, that I was Muslim Brotherhood, that I was Al-Qaeda, and even journalists. I mean, come on.
I mean, some of these stories are real, though. For
yeah, I don't deny them.
My own son, and I think I told the story a couple of years ago here, when he was in kindergarten in this, middle-class district in Berlin. His 2 best friends, and it's very ethnically mixed and wonderful in that way. I mean, we loved it. And his 2 best friends were Mohammed and Ali. And he came home one day and he said, Mama, can 2 women get married? And I said, yeah, of course, 2 women can get married. And he said, Mohammed says they can't. And I said, well, Mohammed is wrong. And he said, well, Ali says Mohammed is right. And so then you're like, okay, I'm outnumbered here. I mean, he was 6 and we're okay. But my point is, these stories, I don't think you can just dismiss them. I mean, I think it's dangerous to just say, well, he's probably like a CIA agent or like a far right. I think you're not doing justice to the real, at the very least, the very real perception of a culturally insecure, if you will, shrinking European, minority. So,
I mean, besides the fact that probably a lot of white societies, especially on the countryside, are super homophobic, super anti-Semitic, and whatever, which makes the Muslims not necessarily the outlier, but rather the very mainstream. Besides that, putting that aside and trying to see it from the critical perspective, I don't deny that that exists. But I think the way how it is being discussed in European countries, how it is heavily racialized and problematized as a Muslim problem, that's bland racism. Yeah.
There is also the opposite story of when Ali went to school and celebrated in class that he had 2 mummies. And the teachers had celebrated that he had 2 mummies, but then he had to tell them that's because daddy's got 3 wives and he's got 2 mummies. And then he was told, actually, that's not the kind of behavior that we celebrate. You're only allowed to have different types of 2 mummies. So it works on both sides about the mutual misunderstanding. Yeah, it's a real story.
It's nice to complicate the narrative. Can we just get Emma and John, any question you had or a closing comment? I don't know if it's one of the both. Just
Yeah, first of all, this was really fascinating. Thank you so much. I was wondering, first of all, as a compliment to Katrin's great question about the cultural aspect, if you could reflect a little bit on ways that this issue has been turbocharged by economic grievance. And then also, Ricky, we were talking at dinner the other night about your extraordinary activist work. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the experience of sort of forming solidarity between in the fight against Islamophobia and the broader sort of anti-racist fight. So I was thinking about the parallel to in the US, like there's a deep kind of division around, is anti-Semitism fought as this like lonely island battle against the oldest hate, or is it part and parcel of the broader fight against white supremacy? And I think that has real implications of kind of this strategy of how you counter these forms of hate. And so I was wondering if you could reflect a little on like the solidarity and the activist work you've done.
I mean, and I wonder if you can get on their table at lunch today, you're going to hear something provocative and compelling and probably a pretty thick narrative. We're probably going to need to do it at the tables if it's okay. I was just hoping to just grab one. Can you say it as well, John?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I've enjoyed speaking with you throughout the past few days as well, Fareed. One name maybe you've noticed that has not been mentioned during our entire conversation is the name of the person who will be the next president of the United States.
That was a relief.
Sorry. And that's Donald Trump. And the reason I bring him up is because there are those who say that his election will embolden the far right, whether it's in Austria, whether it's in France, whether it's in other European countries. What is your view on that? What have you noticed in the countries that you've studied, Fareed?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So maybe we can just get a closing comment from each of our friends, and then we have lunch that's served in Le Cap, which is the same restaurant that we had dinner in last night. The Rain, we'll just change that a little bit, but we'll be someplace special tonight. So closing comment. Activism.
Okay, very quick. The rebranding of the Republican Party once the Tea Party took over and enabled somebody like Donald Trump created a new international environment in which far-right political parties started cooperating across not only their own nation state, but across the Atlantic, across different continents.
Yes.
Jörg Haider was not admitted into Israel when the far-right was in power. 10 years later, you see the Israeli Republican, far-right European, post-fascist, post-Nazi political parties entering Israel as an official delegation, emboldened by the far-right rise as well in Israel. So there is a huge impact that has in terms of the global phenomenon of strengthening far-right populism in the sense of this political family. Very shortly in regards to your question, political science literature at least does not support the claim that that economic grievances necessarily embolden far-right populism and are the basic motives.
And just quickly regarding the far right, I would say that in France, it was very supportive of Donald Trump during the first mandate, but now they don't know how to react because they're in quest of respectability. So so they want to embody the values of the French Republic and to look mainstream. So I was just interviewing a leader from the far right just a couple of days ago, last week. The debate was about can there be a French Trump? And they were not really comfortable because of how Donald Trump behaves and speaks. So I don't know, it may have an influence on their ideology, but I don't think that they want to explicitly connect because it can also damage their image.
Thank you to you both for an outstanding session today.